Hello, here's a news article I found on my LinkedIn feed about a study showing that less intelligent people more likely voted for the UK to leave the EU. The study highlights many hot topics to finally suggest measures that go against democracy. Now, I'm not British, but I find this study problematic for many reasons, and you should too, whether you're British or not. And I promise this is not a political video. I have no horse in this British race, which is anyway concluded since quite a while now. But it's a video about incomplete and ideologically motivated scientific findings that sneak into the media space and slowly and quietly start shaping our ideas, our emotions, and our values. This is a story showing the strategies studies can use to artificially boost opinions. It's about strategies that are far from common in science, but unfortunately create good headlines. I hope you learned something from this, so let's quickly recap what happened during the Brexit. In 2016, the British people decided they wanted their country to leave the European Union, a union they'd been part of since 1973, with a turnout of 72.2%, a slight majority, about 52%, voted they wanted to leave the EU. These results were highly controversial and criticized in the UK and the EU. The Brexit decision became associated with reducing the immigration and other populist right ideologies. And since then, people have been trying to find a scapegoat. Almost 8 years later, I find this news article on my LinkedIn feed. It explains that of the people with the lowest cognitive ability, only 40% voted Remain. But one paragraph below, we find the following quote from the lead author of this research. This study adds to existing academic evidence showing that low cognitive ability makes people more susceptible to misinformation and disinformation. Now, this part caught my attention. Why? Because the claims are quite remarkable, especially in an atmosphere with high concerns for misinformation and disinformation. So I asked myself, could they have confirmed strong connections between cognitive ability, misinformation, disinformation, and voting preferences? Well, I read the article and long story short, no, they could not. The study included data from more than 3,000 British couples who participated in an extensive national survey called Understanding Society. This survey established cognitive ability by testing people's memory, verbal fluency, fluid reasoning, and numerical reasoning. The study found that higher cognitive ability correlated with voting Remain, while lower cognitive ability correlated with voting Leave. So far, the research article associates or reflects well the news article that I read before. However, remember, the lead author claimed that the study added to existing academic evidence on misinformation and disinformation. But as I explained before, the researchers didn't provide any new data on this connection. They only searched the literature and provide connections through the literature. I will explain the problem with this in just a moment. Not only that, the issue got worse once the researchers started discussing how to solve the problem. In short, they started considering technocratic measures. That is a situation where the experts and elite take care of the decision-making. Perhaps a less severe restriction, especially when it comes to complex decisions like EU membership, is leaving it to the experts. In other words, let's set democratic values aside for a while and normalize the idea of delegating decision-making to more qualified people in our society, or so-called technocrats. So what happened here? What allowed them to suggest this type of measures? Well, if you ask me, the researchers had to take detours and connect loose ends in order to come to this point. And as we saw, the researchers could not rely on their own data because it didn't measure or evaluate the connections between misinformation, disinformation, voting preferences, and cognitive ability. They had to use different strategies for this. Let's learn about this.
1.
Cum hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Cum hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy occurs when you assume a causal relationship between two events simply because they correlate. The thing is that correlation doesn't imply causation. For example, although correlated, an increase in ice cream sales doesn't cause an increase in boat accident. They just happen to occur during the summer. In the Brexit study, the researchers found a correlation between cognitive ability and voting preferences, but they overstep when they try to imply a causal relationship between these two. Other factors may have influenced both cognitive ability and voting preferences, even separately. For example, a separate study showed evidence that education, employment type, and employment status were key drivers of the vote leave share. So in other words, other socioeconomic factors could be associated with cognitive ability and voting preferences separately.
2.
False cause fallacy. The false cause fallacy implies a cause and effect relationship between two events without proper evidence. In the Brexit study, the researchers suggested that lower cognitive ability caused increased susceptibility to misinformation without directly evaluating this relationship. The correlation they make between cognitive ability and mis- and disinformation susceptibility relies completely on other literature. It all relies on data that they didn't create themselves. Of course, the researchers are free to discuss what the different connections can mean, but they shouldn't overemphasize this possible connection.
3.
Confirmation bias. Lastly, the research article suffered from a type of bias called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias occurs when we interpret information in a way that confirms our already existing beliefs or hypotheses. In the Brexit study, the authors spent long paragraphs setting the stage to a conclusion that seemed to be their preferred conclusion. That is, that misinformation and disinformation caused the UK's departure from the EU. And lacking this type of evidence, it seems that the authors turned to other type of strategies to confirm this bias, which was, in this case, cherry-picking the literature. The thing is that the authors don't need to be neutral. They can have ideologies, but the research paper needs to be as unbiased and objective as possible. It needs to balance perspective from different literature. Focusing disproportionately on opinions and ideology that aligns with your own perspective will skew the interpretation of the data eventually. And of course, cognitive ability, information intake, and voting preferences may very well be strongly interconnected. But to conclude this, the researchers need more robust data. What they have now is insufficient. But unfortunately, this type of research papers create excellent headlines, and excellent headlines attracts readers, just like me. Overselling incomplete results create flawed ideas without consideration, and we start accepting incomplete arguments more and more in the name of science. And it's a slippery slope from there on. Until we have robust data and clear cause and effect results, we should be very careful before we start suggesting some type of expert-driven decision-making. And thinking about it, should we ever consider this type of excluding approaches in society? What do you think? Especially when we can rely on other more democratic and transparent approaches. For example, how about introspection for a change? Or ask yourself this: how come some European societies still have cognitive ability levels causing havoc? And lastly, let's ask ourselves this as well. With all the campaigning money, how come the EU or the UK couldn't convince the voters to trust the Union, to highlight the advantages or disadvantages, an honest dialogue, So in other words, instead of pointing fingers and striving for more technocracy, why not try democracy or transparency? But that's only my opinion. What do you think? Let me know down below. And until next time, peace.